With Hashem's help, we're going to learn Yevamos Daf Yud Ches. We left off last time Yevamos Yud Zayin Amud Beis, 11 lines from the bottom to none. A quick review. We started the sugya called Yesh Zika or Ein Zika. Everyone agrees, everyone knows the din, the mitzvah, that when a man who's married dies childless, if he has a brother or if he has brothers, there is a connection called zika between his widow and his brother or brothers, which is why there is a mitzvah on him or on them, one of them, to do yibum or chalitza with the widow. The question is, how strong is this connection? Those who hold yesh zika are of the opinion that this connection has certain real halachic consequences. And as we will see, God willing, today in this daf and followed by the next daf, Daf Yutes, that there are opinions that hold that zika is tantamount to marriage, mamish, as if they are already married for certain dinim. There are others who hold ein zika. Yes, there is a connection, which is why there is an obligation on the brother or one of the brothers to do yibum or chalitza with the widow. But that connection doesn't have any other effect other than giving the mitzvah of yibum or chalitza. Everyone is going to hold, even the people who hold that yesh zika, if chalitza is done, then the zika is no longer. The question we will have is before yibum or chalitza was done. If the woman died before chalitza was done to her, and that was the opening case, that the Rav Huna said in the name of Rav, that while the woman is waiting for yibum or chalitza, she dies, then the brother is allowed to marry her mother. What's the chiddush? Huge. A man is never allowed to marry his wife's mother. Even if one's wife passes away, even if a person divorces his wife. When Rav Huna, in the name of Rav, says that Shemeres Yavam Shemesa Mutar Be'ima, he is of the opinion of Ein Zika. They were never connected enough for it to be considered like a marriage, and therefore he could marry the mother even though nothing was done to her, chalitza was not done to her. So Tanan asked the Gemara against the opinion of Rav Huna. We learned in the Mishnah later in Daf Mem Tes, Yevamos Shemeisa, Yevimtoi Shemeisa, Mutar B'Achaisa, that if while a man is waiting to do Yibum or Chalitza with his brother's widow, she dies, the Mishnah says he's allowed to marry her sister. Now, when it comes to the erva of marrying one's wife's sister, there's a unique leniency we find in the Torah, which is, during the person's wife's life, Reuven, let's say, marries Rachel, as long as Rachel is living, even if Reuven divorced her, Reuven is prohibited to marry Leah. It's called Achais Ishtai, one of the Arayas. But if Rachel dies, then Reuven is allowed to marry Leah. And therefore, likewise, if Shimon is waiting to do Yibum with Rachel, because Reuven was married to Rachel, Reuven died, Shimon is waiting to do Yibum, and now Rachel dies, so he can marry Leah. So the Gemara says, should we not imply from that Mishnah that that Shimon can marry Rachel's sister, but the Imaloi, not the mother? Because if he would have been allowed to marry the mother, that is a much greater chiddush. Why wouldn't the Mishnah write that? And that, furthermore, being that is a stam Mishnah, in other words, a Mishnah without an author, normally the rule is that whenever Rebbe wrote a halacha in a Mishnah without writing an author, that's because Rebbe is telling you that the halacha is like the stam Mishnah. So this stam Mishnah is implying that yesh zika, which is why it's asr be'ima. Answers the Gemara, really, the Mishnah would hold that in the case that we gave Reuven married to Rachel, Reuven passes away, Shimon, before he does Yibum or Chalitza with Rachel, Rachel dies, that he's allowed to marry Leah, he's really allowed to marry the mother as well. But since the Mishnah began teaching you the din that the erva of achos ishtoi only goes as long as she's living, and if a person's wife or ex-wife passes away, then the man is allowed to marry her sister. And over there it's taka only ba'achoisa, but a man will never be allowed to marry his wife's or ex-wife's mother, be'imaloi, tahabaloi, surah deoraisa. So in order for the Mishnah to be symmetrical, which is a very common thing, the Mishnah repeated the same wordings when it came to the Seifa, when we were speaking about a Shemeres Yavim. Yevimta Ishamesa. Tanami Seifa Muta Ba'achaisa. Okay, that is the Shita of Rav Huna, Ein Zika. Comes along Rav Yehuda, 5 lines on the bottom. Rav Yehuda Amar, Shemeres Yavim Shemesa, Asur Be'iman, the opposite. Even though nothing was done to her, nevertheless, since Shimon was awaiting, there was this connection with Rachel, Reuven's wife, that will already make it prohibited for Shimon to ever marry Rachel's mother. Alma Kosovar, that Rav Yehuda holds, Yesh Zika. So now the Gemara is going to go through the same questions we had before on Afuna. So why, asked the Gemara, why did he have to give a scenario? Why couldn't he say Stam, that halacha, kedivrei ha'emer, that the halacha is like Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira, that says Yesh Zika, which was the case that we spoke about on last year, that there are 3 brothers, Reuven, Shimon, and Levi. Reuven is married to Rachel. Rachel has a sister Leah, who's married to no one in the meanwhile. Reuven dies. So now there's a mitzvah either on Shimon or on Levi to do Yibum or Chalitza with Rachel. Stands up Levi, and Levi gives Kedushin to Leah. So Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira tells Levi, you shouldn't have done Kedushin to her. Because since that her sister is awaiting Yibum or Chalitza either from you or from your brother Shimon, she's called Achoy Zikul Kasai, you shouldn't marry her. Wait, let Shimon do Yibum or Chalitza with Rachel, and only then should you marry Leah. In other words, Yesh Zika. So why couldn't he say Yesh Zika? So the Gemara answers, Ihava Amar Hachi, had Rav Yehuda said that, Havamin, I would have thought that when does Rav Yehuda hold Yesh Zika only when there's one brother, but not when there's 2 brothers? Because it makes a lot more sense that if there's only Reuven and Shimon, which means that the mitzvah is on Shimon, then Shimon has a stronger connection to Reuven's widow, versus in a case where you have 2 brothers or 3 brothers, etc. So the Gemara says, 1 second. But Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira's case was when there were 2 brothers. There was Reuven and then Shimon and Levi. And even there, Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira said that Shimon should not marry Leah, wait until Shimon does Yibum or Chalitza with Rachel. So the Gemara says, Eli Omar Hachi. Turn the page, Daf Yud Ches, that if Rabbi Yehuda would have said Halacha ki Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira, I might have thought that when do we hold that Yesh Zika Mechayim? Mechayim means as long as the Shemeres Yavim is alive. Don't forget that's the case that Rachel is living. Leah is Achoy Zikul Kasei. But in the case where she died, Rachel died, Avala Achamisa, one would argue that even if you hold the Yesh Zika, but now that she passed away, Pakala Zika, the Zika went away. And like we mentioned a few moments ago, that even the opinions that hold Yesh Zika, that's only up until Chalitza. Everyone agrees that if the brother or one of the brothers does Chalitza, there's no more connection, and they would be allowed to marry the mother, even if he Yesh Zika. So you see that Zika is not like a marriage. So maybe death does the same thing that Chalitza does. Kumash Malan, that's why Rabbi Yehuda gave his case to teach you the Zika Bechdi, that Zika with nothing, Loi Paka, does not dissolve, does not go away. If Chalitza is done, if an action is done, the action of Chalitza takes away the Zika. But if there is no action of Chalitza, then the Zika remains, and therefore Shimon can never marry Rachel's mother. Now Fakir, the same Mishnah that we brought before against Rav Huna, is now being brought as l'chayra, a proof to Rav Yehuda, that it says, l'kamen and daf memtes, yevimto yishemeisa muta ba'achaysa, and that l'chayra implies ba'achaysa in be'imaloi, Answers the Gemara, maybe Rav Huna's right. And afilu be'ima, that you will be allowed to marry the mother. Why didn't the Mishnah teach you the bigger chiddush? And there, when it comes to marriage, that's only dafka ba'achoisa. But a person can never marry one's wife's mother, even if she passed away. So the Reish of the Mishnah begins dafka in the case of achoisa. So Tananami Seifa, muter ba'achoisa. Now comes along the Gemara, and the Gemara is going to challenge Rav Yehuda from our Mishnah. Mosiv Rav Huna Bar Chiya. It says in our Mishnah, Reuven, in the case of the non-contemporary brother, right? Reuven is married to Rachel, and Reuven dies, and now there's Shimon, and it says Asa b'Maimer. Shimon does Maimer to Rachel, Umeis, and Shimon dies, right? And Levi was born. And when Levi was born, she was already connected to Shimon through Maimar, through the rabbinic pre-Yibum. So it says that that Shimon's co-wife, which Midoiraisa was the only wife, Midoiraisa, she was not Tzoras Erva, she would need Yibum or Chalitza. But since Midrabanan, there was a Maimar, there was a rabbinic marriage, so Midrabanan, she is a Tzaras Erva, so now the Gemara asks, very simple, if you hold Yesh Zika, why did we even need to say that Maimar was done, even if Maimar wasn't done? The very fact that Reuven dies, and now there's a Zika between Rachel and Shimon, should make the tzaras, should make the co-wife a tzaras erva. Time adavar b'maimer, holav b'maimer, shniyanami yivu miyabba. If not for the maimer, right? So then the only wife of Shimon who falls to Yibum to Levi, Levi is a contemporary brother to Shimon. Levi would be allowed to do Yibum with her. V'iyamar yesh zika. But if there is a zika, that zika should also make Shimon's wife some sort of co-wife with Reuven's widow, and Reuven's widow, who was a non-contemporary with Levi, is an erva. Great question. So Amar Rabba says, Rabba, you should know that according to Rav Yehuda, according to the opinions that hold the Yesh Zika, Afal Gav Dili Ovid B'Maimer, even when Maimer was not done between Shimon and Reuven's widow, Shnia Michlatz Cholza, that the only thing Levi can do to Shimon's only wife is Chalitza, and he cannot do Yibum. Why can he not do Yibum? Because since there's a Zika between Shimon and Reuven's widow, so that already connects Shimon's co-wife and the Erva, and therefore Yibum cannot be done. Why did the Mishnah give a case where he did Maimer? That's Lafuke me Beishamai. That's to tell you that we don't rule like Beishamai. What does Beishamai hold? The Amrei Beishamai holds Maimer, Kaina, Kinyan, Gomer. Beishamai holds that Maimer isn't a rabbinic pre-Yibum. Beishamai holds that when a man gives Kiddushin to his Yevamo, she's fully married to him. And if that would have been the case, then if Shimon gave Maimer to Reuven's widow, and if Maimer is marriage, Shimon has two wives. His other wife is a real tzaras erva, and the din would have been, we don't paskin like Beishamai. The din is that just like Yibum and Chalitza does not apply to an erva, nor does it apply to tzaras erva. So the Mishnah tells you that even though Maimer was done, Chalitza should still be done. Eis Abaya asks Abaya against Rav Yehuda. It says in a Braisa, Shnei Achim ba'olam echad, when two brothers were living at the same time. Reuven and Shimon were alive at the same time. Umeis echad behem b'olivlad, Reuven dies. V'aman ha'sheni hazem gets up Shimon, lasis Maimer b'yevimtoi, and he's planning to do Maimer in Reuven's widow. That's called her Rachel. But before Shimon did Maimer and Rachel, Levi is born. Levi is a contemporary with Shimon. Levi is not a contemporary with Reuven. And now Umeis, and now Shimon dies. So the din in the Braisa is Harishayna, Reuven's widow is completely free to marry whoever she wants. She's Yoitza. Why is she not bound to Levi? Mishum Eishes Achiv Shaloi Hay B'Yalami. Levi was not alive when Reuven was alive. He cannot marry her. However, Vishnia, but the wife of Shimon, Oy Chayletzes Oy Misyabemas, being that he didn't even do Maimer yet, Levi is a contemporary with Shimon, so therefore there's a mitzvah of Yibum and Chalitz. You see, here the Brisa said clearly that if Shimon did not do Maimer, then Levi has to marry Shimon's co-wife. Now, one second. Now, Yibum or Chalitza. If Yesh Zika, then Shimon's co-wife became a co-wife to Reuven's widow because of the Zika. V'yamarti Yesh Zika, Havalot, Tzoras Eshes Achlimlamai, V'Zika, and even though you might allow Chalitza, but the Yibum should be Asr. Kasha. Now, don't forget that we began off the Sugya with the Braisa of Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira, right? Reuven, Shimon, Levi. Reuven dies. Reuven left a widow called Rachel. Levi did Kedushin with Leah. And Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira says, don't marry Leah until Shimon does even more Chalitza with Rachel. Chachamim disagreed with that. So we have a Machlekes Tanoim. It's not the end of the world to find a Braisa or a Mishnah that holds one side. It's not going to refute the other Amayra, because the other Amayra can rely on the other Tana. The challenge is when you have a Stam Mishnah. Whenever the Mishnahs were written without authors, that implies that the halach is Stam Mishnah. This Mishnah is a Stam Mishnah. And it implies that Ein Zika. So the Gemara answers, this Mishnah is not a Stam Mishnah. Hamani Rav Meiri. That there clearly it says at the end, Divrei Rabbi Meir. Rav Meir says Ein Zika. And therefore maybe our Mishnah is also Rabbi Meir. But whenever you write the words Divrei Rabbi Meir, the halacha doesn't necessarily have to follow that. The concept of halacha kistam Mishnah is only if a Mishnah is written without an author. So Bekitzer Rav Meir holds Ein Zika, which is why Rav Meir says that Shimon's wife now Chayletzes Oy Mis Yevamos. However, if you would hold that Yesh Zika, then you would only be allowed to do Chalitz. Frekti Gemara Mis Viralel Rav Meir Ein Zika. Even though Taka you wrote that Braisa is Rabbi Meir. It says Rav Meir says Ein Zika, but I have a stira between that Rav Meir and another Rabbi Meir, because we learned in another Mishnah. We're going to learn it later in Daf Chav Gimel. And again, in this Mishnah that we're quoting, no name is written, but there's a rule that whenever a name is not written in a Mishnah, Stam Mishnah is Rabbi Meir. It says Arbo Achim. Okay, I'm sorry. I see Chav Gimel, Chavav, Chav Zayin, and Idios. That Arbo Achim. When you have four brothers, Shnayim Mehem Nasuim Shtei Achoyos, Reuven, Shimon, Levi, and Yehuda. Reuven married Rachel, Shimon married Leah, and Reuven and Shimon both died. Umeisu HaNasuim. And now you have two sisters, Rachel and Leah, and you have Levi and Yehuda. So it says over there, Ha'achoyos, both of the sisters, only Chalitza could be done to them, and not Yibum. Now, why not Yibum? So we learned this many times before, because each one is called Achoy Zikul Kasei. But one second, if you hold Ein Zikon, and if Rabbi Meir, who's the author of this Mishnah, clearly said Ein Zikon, let Levi marry Rachel, let Yehuda marry Leah. There's no Zikon. He's marrying not Achoy Zikul Kasei. There should be no consequence of Zikon, other than the mitzvah of doing Yibum and Chalitz. Hani mitrei bati kosinon. Each sister comes from another marriage. One was Reuven's wife, one was Shimon's wife. Haili abim chada, haili abim chada. Let each surviving brother do yibum on one of them. So the Gemara says, one second, this Mishnah is Takei Rabbi Meir, and Rabbi Meir holds Ein Zika. And the reason why the Mishnah says that you can only do chalitza, not yibum, not because of a chayzuko kasei, because of a new din. Mishum de kosaver, because Rav Meir holds asur levatel mitzvahs yevamim. You are not allowed to do something which will nullify the mitzvah of yibum. We had that before in the previous daf. How would yibum nullify the mitzvah of yevamim? So now the Gemara says a svara that has to be understood, but this is what the Gemara is going to say. The Dilma Ademiyabim Chad. Let's say Levi is going to do Yibum with Rachel. So who's left now? Yehuda and Leah. What would happen if Yehuda would die now? If Yehuda would die now, then the only brother left who could do Yibum or Chalitza with Leah is Levi. But Levi married Rachel. Married. He cannot marry Leah because Leah now will become a Chais Ishtoi. And now, being that she became an Erva, she doesn't need not Yibum nor Chalitza. Before there was an obligation, and now something happened which took her out of the mitzvah. If Levi is only going to do Chalitza with Rachel, now Levi can marry, really, Leah. So Rashi asks, so why didn't Rav Meir say that the first one should do Chalitza, but the second one should do Yibum? Because really there's nothing wrong with the second one doing Yibum. Because the mitzvah was done with the first, and now you have a mitzvah with the second. So Rashi says, because the Chachamim were afraid that if we would allow the second one to do Yibum, then the first one would do Yibum, which is a very common rabbinic fear. So they said across the board, no one can do Yibum. That if Chad, that Mayis Idach, if the other one would die, the Kabatalta mitzvah Yevamim. Tosfos points out, and we learned this together, for example, in the beginning of Masechtas Yuma, do we have to get a backup wife for the Kohen Gadol? The Kohen Gadol, 7 days before Yom Kippur, was sequestered, and he was trained, and he was kept away from a possibility of Tumah, getting ready for Yom Kippur. And then there were Tanoim that held that you have to prepare for him, just in case, God forbid, his wife dies. Kohen Gadol can only do the avodah if he's married, so there has to be, so to say, a backup wife. And maybe a backup wife to the backup wife. And then there are Tanoim that say, we're not afraid that she's going to die. And Tosfos quotes other dinim throughout Shas, not necessarily connected to death of a person, but are we afraid that a utensil is going to break? Normally, Rabbi Meir is of the opinion that we don't have to be worried about such a possibility, which is a contradiction to what we're saying here, that Rabbi Meir is afraid that one brother is going to die. So Tosfos explains the following. Whenever we have, for example, the case of Yom Kippur, there's 1 week. Should we have a fear that during this week someone is going to die? Rabbi Meir says not. But whenever there's a mitzvah that is not time-bound, Yibum or Chalitza is not a time-bound mitzvah. Take is Rizin Magdim ala mitzvahs, general. But Levi and Yehuda, they can do Yibum today, they can do Yibum in 10 years. They can do it later. Once you have a non-time-bound mitzvah, so the more time goes by, the more possibility that someone could die. That's why here Rav Meir is Chayish L'misa. Now, the Gemara says, 1 second. The im ein zika. Since Rav Meir holds ein zika, the Gemara is going to show you that there is another Tana, the Tana of Rabban Gamliel, who holds ein zika, and Rabbi Gamliel is not worried about being mevatel the whole mitzvahs Yevamim, as if they go together. That if you hold ein Yevamim, tivatel, let the mitzvah of Yibum be nullified. And where do we find this link? Where do we find the Tana that holds ein zika and does not care if the mitzvah will become nullified? To Rabbi Gamliel, who says ein zika, and Rabbi Gamliel holds muter levatel mitzvahs Yevamim. Where do we see that? The Tanan. We learned in the Mishnah, Rabbi Gamliel Oimer, the case over there is very simple. You have 2 brothers and 2 sisters. Reuven is married to Rachel, and Shimon is married to Leah. However, Leah was married off either by her mother or her older brother, or by her father the second time. In other words, Leah is under 12, she's a katana, who's only married to Shimon by a rabbinic marriage, which thus gives the wife, the minor, Leah, the power to do miyun, which would retroactively nullify the marriage. Now, Rachel and Reuven, 2 adults. Reuven dies. Midoi Raisa, there's no marriage. So Midoi Raisa, if Shimon is not married to Leah, who does Shimon have to marry? Yibum or Chalitza? With Rachel. But Midrabanan, there is a marriage. And since there is a marriage, who's Rachel? Achois Ishtoi. So the Tanakama there says that we forced Leah to do miyun. We don't want to be mevatel the whole mitzvah of Yibum. So we tell Leah, you refuse Shimon, which means you were never married to Shimon. So now Shimon can do Yibum or Chalitza with Rachel. Comes on Rabbi Gamliel and he says, no. Imei Ana, listen, Leah can do Miyun. If she does Miyun, then good, Gesundheit hate, let her do Miyun. And if Leah does Miyun, now Shimon has a mitzvah Yibum or Chalitza with Rachel. But V'im Loi Miyana, but if Leah doesn't want to do Miyun, then we don't mind for them to live together. Tamtin Achadaktil. Let's see what happens until Leah becomes an adult. And if Leah becomes an adult, that means 12 and developing Samanim, and she has a relation with her husband Shimon, now that marriage is Mida Oyraisa. Now Rachel becomes Achois Ishtoi, and V'teitzi Halazu. And now Rachel is free to marry whoever she wants. Mishum Achois Isham. What do we see over here? First of all, we see that Rabbi Gamliel holds that ain't Zika. Why? Because if he would have held Yesh Zika, how can he say, Rabbi Gamliel, that Shimon can continue to live with Leah? He has Zika with Rachel. Leah now became Achay Zikul Kasei. So first of all, they can stay together. He holds Ein Zika. Second of all, he clearly states that if she'll become an adult, then she'll become a wife. That will be Mavatal, the mitzvah of Yivim with Rachel. He doesn't care for that. So you see, the Tana who holds Ein Zika doesn't care about Tibatal mitzvahs Yivamin. So why wouldn't Rav Meir? Why should Rav Meir care if there's going to be a nullification of mitzvahs Yivamin? So the Gemara says, Amalei. So Rabbi tells Abai, I don't understand. You're asking a stira between Rabbi Gamliel and Ameir. Karamis, two Tanaim. Rabbi Gamliel holds Ein Zika. Rabbi Gamliel is a Tana. He has the right to hold. We don't care if Tibatal mitzvahs Yivamim. Rabbi Meir holds Ein Zika, and Rabbi Meir does care if Rabbi Meir doesn't want to be Mavatal the mitzvahs of Yivamim. So Loi. So Abai explains to Rabbi Yosef, to Rabban, Hachi coming in, and this is what I meant to ask. I find it very strange to say that Rav Meir is chayish even to maybe a brother will die. And Rab Gamliel, who clearly paints a case where vadai there's going to be a bittul mitzvah, like chayish. It's too extreme. But still the Gemara says, Rabbi tells Abaye, so what? Dilma, man de loy chayish, Rabbi Gamliel, afilu levadi loy chayish. But Bekitzer, Rav Yehuda was not refuted. We said that Rav Meir Taka holds Ein Zika. Rabbi Yossi Haglili holds Yesh Zika. And that's the opinion of Rav Yehuda. Now, Rav Huna said a statement in the name of Rav. When Rav Yehuda said that Yesh Zika, he didn't say whose Torah he's repeating. We learned many times already that Rav Yehuda was the Talmud of Rav. After Rav passed away, he became a Talmud of Shmuel. We also learned a few pages ago that Rav Yehuda was a Talmud of Rav Asi. So in other words, there were certain Amoraim that had only one Rebbe. So when they made a statement, even if they did not quote the Shem Oimrei, we know who they learned it from. The Gemara wants to know, this din of Rav Yehuda, Yesh Zika, from which Rebbe did he get it from? So Amalei Abayel Rav Yosef, I want you to know how the Rav Yehuda came from Shmuel. The Tran turning the page, Shemeres Yavam, Shekidish Achiv Es Achoisam. That was the case that we gave in the beginning. Reuven, Shimon, and Levi. Reuven married Rachel. Reuven died. So there's a mitzvah on Shimon or on Levi to do Yibum or Chalitza with Rachel. Comes along Levi and he gives Kiddush and Gar to Leah, to Rachel's sister. So Rabbi Yehuda ben Meseida tells Levi and Leah, wait, don't get fully married until Shimon does the mitzvah with Rachel. Rabbi Yehuda ben Meseida, Amru, Oimrim Loi, we tell, or Yibum. Shimon can do Yibum or Chalitza with Rachel. And why? How did we explain it with the Ben Meseida? Because Yesh Zika. Because if you would hold the Ein Zika, who cares? Who cares if Leah and Levi get married? Let them get married. Nothing wrong. There's a Rachel, there's a Shimon. The reason why it's problematic on Leah and on Levi is because Yesh Zika. And Shmuel said, Halacha ki Rabbi Yehuda ben Meseida. So now it makes sense. Rabbi Yehuda says, Halacha ki Yehuda ben Meseida. Rabbi Yehuda ben Meseida says, Yesh Zika. So Rabbi Yehuda, who taught Yesh Zika, is quoting Shmuel. So the Gemara says that Rabbi Yosef tells Abaya, Amar Lei, 1 second. The Irav Mai, what would be wrong if Rav Yehuda would have said it in the name of Rav? What would have been wrong? We're skipping the parentheses. That Kashya, the Rav, the Rav. There would be a stira. Rav Huna also quoted Rav. So what did Rav say? That's not a problem. Explains the Gemara. It's common that we find a machlokes amongst Amoraim regarding what another Amoraim said. Dilma, Amorai, Nino, Va'alibu Darav. It wouldn't have been a terrible thing if both Rav Huna and Rav Yehuda would have been saying a din Mishmei de Rav, each one a different opinion of what Rav said. So the Gemara says, no, the Kiv and the Itmer Mishmei de Shmuel Behedya. Since we know that Shmuel holds Yesh Zikam, Mishmei de Rav, and if Rav Yehuda's din would have been in the name of Rav, it would have been Ka'amay Ra'i. So it's a lot better. Lo Shafkinan Mishmei de Shmuel Behedya. Doesn't make sense to do that. And therefore it's in the name of Shmuel. When I was repeating all of this in front of Rab Zvid, Amar, he tells me, Atun Haki Masnisula. I hear the way you learned it. Anan, my tradition was Behedya Masnin Allah. That Lechatchila I heard Rav Yehuda saying the din in the name of Shmuel. That Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel, Shemeres Yavam Shemeisa Asur Be'imam. Alma we see, Kosavar Shmuel holds Yesh Zikon. And now on this we say Va'az the Shmuel Taimei. That Shmuel said Halacha Rav Yehuda ben Beseiram. So it fits. So in the case of the 3 brothers and the 2 sisters, Halacha Rav Yehuda ben Beseiram, and Shemeres Yavam Shemeisa Asur Be'ima Halacha da Yesh Zikon. Now the Gemara says V'tzrichon. Shmuel needed to say both dinim. The Iyashmi Inan Yesh Zikon. If he would have said only the case of Shemeres Yavam, Shemeisa, Havamina, I might have thought that you know why Reuven and Shimon. Reuven died. Shimon has a mitzvah to do Yibum with Rachel. Rachel dies. So now Shimon cannot marry Rachel's mother. Maybe that's only because there's only one brother. Since there's only one brother, Shimon was the only one able and therefore obligated to do Yibum or Chalitza with Rachel. Now there's a bond. But maybe Betrei, but maybe if Reuven dies and there's a Shimon and a Levi, each brother can throw the mitzvah to the other one. Maybe you don't say Zika. Kumash V'lan, that's why Shmuel needed to say Halacha K'Rebbe Ben Meseira. That even when there's a Shimon and there's a Levi, you tell Levi, Hamtain, don't marry Leah until Shimon does Yibum or Chalitza with Rachel. And reverse. Dear Rachel is alive. Don't marry Leah until your brother does Yibum or Chalitza with the living widow. But maybe La'achar Misam, Shemeres Yavam Shemeisa, maybe Pakala Zika. Don't forget, Chalitza takes away the Zika. Maybe death takes away the Zika. Kumash Malan. Again, Shmuel says that you're not allowed to marry the mother. The Zika bichdi loy paka. Zika does not go away without doing anything. Chalitza is an act. If there's no action, the Zika remains even after death. Okay. Next Mishnah. The niceness about the next Mishnah and the whole Daf Yutes. The whole Daf Yutes is that we learned this din before. So let's do this by heart. And then we're going to go details into the Mishnah and Gemara. It's a very geshmaka, easy, especially for people that have been with us from the beginning. Then this entire daf becomes a very smooth daf. Returning to the 14th erev of the Mishnah, to the first Mishnah of the second Perek, the non-contemporary brother erev. So, a man normally is never allowed to marry his brother's wife. She's one of the 21 Aroyos. She's called Eishes Ach. That means even if one brother, Reuven and Shimon, Reuven is married to Rachel, Reuven divorces Rachel. She's not a married woman. Shimon is not allowed to marry her. The exception is when Reuven dies without children. There, not only is there no Isur, there is some sort of connection, how strong Machlaik is, and there's a mitzvah, Yibum or Chalitz. Good. When do we have the mitzvah of Yibum and Chalitza? only for the brother or the brothers that were living when Reuven died. But if after Reuven died, then another brother was born, that other brother is called a non-contemporary brother. That non-contemporary brother is not allowed to marry Reuven's widow because of the erva of your brother's wife. There's no mitzvah of yibum on him because he wasn't alive when Reuven died. So the moment there's no mitzvah of yibum, the original erva, eishes ach, is on him. Okay, that is something that was across the board according to the Tanna Kama. And then we mentioned in the first Perek, and we mentioned it again, that there is a Tana, Rabbi Shimon, that disagrees with that. There is a Tana, Rabbi Shimon, that holds that there are cases where the non-contemporary brother could marry this widow of Reuven. Question is, what case would that be? So we're going to review by heart the first Mishnah. The first Mishnah in the second Perek gave a case that Reuven died. After Reuven died, Levi was born. After Levi was born, Shimon, who was living when Reuven died, Shimon did Yibum with Reuven's widow, let's call her Rachel. Shimon also had another wife, not a sister, another wife. And now Shimon died. So said our Mishnah, this is the case, that Levi, first of all, is not allowed to marry the one who was Reuven's wife. She is an erva. And being that she was also married to Shimon, so the other wife of Shimon became her co-wife. So there's an exemption on both Yibam and Chalitz. Now comes along this Mishnah. The Mishnah gives another scenario. That Shnei Achim, two brothers, Reuven and Shimon. Umeis echad mehem, Reuven dies. Not like in the previous Mishnah that Levi is born. Levi wasn't born yet. After Reuven died, v'yibem hasheni es eishes achiv. Shimon marries Rachel. Shimon had another wife. And now it's called Yibem v'achar kach noilad. That's this case. First Shimon did Yibum, and now Levi is born. And now Umeis, and now Shimon dies. So the Chachamim hold, even in this case, the Chachamim is very simple. We don't care. She was Reuven's wife. Levi wasn't alive when Reuven died. Levi is never allowed to marry her. Erva. And if there was a co-wife to her, he's not allowed to marry the co-wife either. And therefore, no Yibum, no Chalitz. Then our Rishayna, Reuven's wife, Yoitzah, she becomes exempt from Yibum and Chalitza or Chalitza because she still is Eishes Achiv Shaloi Hoya Ba'ilamai. And the other wife of Shimon, even though Levi and Shimon were alive at the same time, but now that Shimon did Yibum with Reuven's wife, she's a co-wife. V'hashniya Mishum Tzarasa. And therefore, next case of still the Chachamim, what happens if Shimon didn't marry Reuven's widow? He only did Maimer. We got to define what Maimer is. Also, by Maimer, we're going to learn that it's a rabbinic marriage. In other words, that woman can never marry Levi. Levi can never marry her. Question is Shimon's other wife called a co-wife? If Maimer is only a rabbinic marriage, then Midoy Raisa, she's not a co-wife. And therefore, Umeis,
not a co-wife,
then he has to do it. So Umeis, so we have this case many times whenever there's a rabbinic marriage. So the way you resolve the challenge is by doing only chalitza. So hashni chalitza shalom yisyabemes. Now comes Rab Shimon. Now Rab Shimon's opinion is quoted in this Mishnah. This Mishnah gives the case where it was Yibeim v'achar kach noilad. This is the easiest case for Rab Shimon to argue, this case. That if Shimon first married Reuven's widow, and now Levi is born, so when Levi comes into the world, that Rachel is not Reuven's widow. Rachel is Shimon's wife. Shimon says, this is not the case of a non-contemporary brother. Levi could marry her, is obligated Yibam or Chalitza, either to her or to the co-wife. It was Rab Shimon's opinion that's quoted in this Mishnah is clear that in this case, when it was Yibem va'achar kach noilad, Rab Shimon is lenient. The question we will have in the Gemara will be, maybe Rab Shimon was only quoted here because we allowed the Chachamim to speak out all their cases. But perhaps Rab Shimon also is lenient in the first case. Even if Levi was born before Shimon did Yibum to Reuven's widow, since Shimon did Yibum, now she is Shimon's wife. Shimon and Levi are alive at the same time. You can argue here also, if now Shimon dies, Levi has to do Yibum or Chalitza with her. Where would Rab Shimon hold that Eishes Achiv Shaloi Haya Beilame is Aser if Shimon Bechal didn't do Yibum to her? Reuven died. Only Shimon is living now. Shimon did nothing. And now Levi is born. So we tell Levi, you cannot marry that woman. No Yibum, no Chalitza, nothing. But the moment Shimon does Yibum, perhaps, even though Levi was born before Yibum was done, now that she becomes Shimon's wife, and Shimon and Levi are alive at the same time, if Shimon dies, maybe here also Rab Shimon is lenient. That will be the whole daf. How much does Rab Shimon argue with the Chachamim? How lenient is he? So in this case, clearly, Rab Shimon says, Mi yabim le'ezu mehem she'yirtze. Oy chayletz le'ezu mehem she'yirtze. Yibim b'achakach noilad. Levi came into the world with Rachel being Shimon's wife, and therefore there's no erva. Comes along Gemara, Amar Rabbi Oishia. We correct from Rav to Rabbi. We'll see clearly in the Gemara later, Tosfos will point out, that Rav Oishia is challenging Rabbi Oishia. Obviously they can't be the same person. So it's a mistake in the Girsa. If it would be Rav Oishia, then you can't have a Rav Oishia challenging Rav Oishia. Okay, Amar Rabbi Oishia. You should know he was very lenient. That Chaluk, Hoya, Rab Shimon, Af Barishanim. Even in the case of the first mission of this Perek, even if Noilad va'achar kach yibim, if Shimon then does Yibum to Reuven's widow, and then Shimon dies, Levi is allowed to marry her, Levi is obligated, Yibum or Chalitza. And I'll tell you why, says Rabbi Yoshia. Because if Rab Shimon only would have argued in this case, that's where they argue. Why did we need the whole first Mishnah? The whole thing is extra. Only write this case. It means the Chachamim are so machmir. The Chachamim hold that even if Yibim va'achar kach noilad, Levi can never marry her, then for sure, if Levi was born before Yibum, she's even a bigger widow of Reuven. So who needed the whole thing? And Bavak the Reisha Laman, why did the Rebbe who ordered the Mishnayos write the first Mishnah of the second Perek? If it's to tell you the din of the Chachamim, who needs that? Hash the Yibim L'Basayf Noilad. Now that we have this Mishnah, who gives a case where Rab Shimon argues, still, and Rab Shimon argues it makes sense, because the Chi'ashkecha, because when Levi came into the world and he found this woman, Rachel, he saw Rachel as Shimon's wife, not as Reuven's widow. Nevertheless, Asri Rabbanan. So for sure, in the case of the first Mishnah, where it was Nailad, Va'achar Kachibim, Mibayeh, Elalav, it must be the Rab Shimon Yitzrach, that with the Rebbe wrote the first Mishnah to tell you the Chiddush of Rab Shimon, that he is lenient even in the first case. V'tana Reishol L'diachakech Rab Shimon. V'tana Seifol L'diachakech Rabbanan. Ubedin, says Rabbi Oishia, the Nifloik Rab Shimon Bereisha. Rabbi should have quoted Rab Shimon's din, which is a bigger chiddush in the first mission. Elamai, that's the way the right etiquette is. When you have two people giving their opinions, allow the first one to speak out fully his opinion, and then you record the disagreeing opinion. Rabbi waited for the Rabbanan ad Mesaimi limul sayu, for them to finish speaking about all their scenarios. First scenario was Noilad v'achar kach Yibim, and then the Chachamim says, and even if Yibim v'achar kach Noilad, always Asir. And now v'hadr pali golayu, and then Rab Shimon disagrees. So the Gemara says, 1 second. If Rabbi Yoshua is explaining that Rabbi Shimon is so lenient that even if Noilad v'achar kach Yibim, she's not an erva, so when is there the erva of Eishes Achiv Shaloi Hoya Be'olami? So the Gemara says, Ela Eishes Achiv Shaloi Hoya Be'olami Rab Shimon Heich Mishkachas La. Two options. Option number one, B'chad Achomis, when there's only one brother, there's only Reuven. Reuven lived, Reuven married Rachel, Reuven died. No brothers. After Reuven died, Shimon is born. Okay, Shimon can never marry Rachel. Non-contemporary brother. Or, like we spoke about before, Inami. No. When Reuven died, Shimon was living. Shimon did not do Yibam or Chalitza, did nothing. And Levi is born. So Hashem is telling Levi, you cannot do Yibam or Chalitza to Rachel. Has nothing to do with you. Inami Taka, there were two brothers. Means even when Reuven died, there was another brother. But the other brother, Shimon, did not do Yibam, did not die. Levi is born into the world. So Levi is not allowed to marry Rachel.
Second, if Shimon had done, let's say Chalitza, right? And then later on Levi was born.
Doesn't help. Because
Did
being...
you ever marry her?
No, doesn't help. Why doesn't it help? According to everyone. Because just like a case of an old brother, let's say a brother has kids. Reuven has kids. Reuven dies. No one can ever marry Reuven's brothers can never marry the widow. It's Eshesach. Whenever there's no mitzvah of Yibum, the Erev of Eshesach goes back. Right. Now the Gemara says, Bishlem Yibum, what will be the logic of Rab Shimon? In the case that Reuven died, Levi doesn't exist yet. Shimon married her, Yibum, and now Levi is born. It makes sense why Rabbi Shimon holds that later, if Shimon dies, Levi can do Yibum or Chalitza, because Ki Ashkecha, when Levi found the widow of Reuven, she wasn't the widow of Reuven, she was the wife of Shimon. Behetera Ashkecha, he found her a permissible woman. It's permissible in this context. Ela Noila Vachakach Yibum Maitamo. What would be the logic for Rab Shimon to be lenient? Shimon, when Reuven died, she was only Reuven's widow. And if Levi is born, why would Levi later be allowed to do Yibum or Chalitza? So the Gemara goes back to the previous sugya, because Rabbi Shimon holds Yesh Zika. And now the Gemara words it beautifully. Vezika kekenusya damya. The meaning of Yesh Zika is that Zika is like a marriage. Now it makes sense. When Reuven died, there was only one brother, Shimon. Before Shimon did anything, the Zika itself is marriage. True, he can do Chalitza. And if Shimon would do Chalitza, it's like a get. But before he did anything, Shimon is married to her. Now it makes sense. If Levi is born now, Levi is born Behetero. Levi is born, who is she? She's not Reuven's widow. She's the Zekuka of Shimon. Shimon is a contemporary brother. What's Rab Shimon's opinion, according to Rabbi Oisha, has to make sense, can only make sense if Rabbi Shimon holds Yesh Zika, and not Stam Yesh Zika. Yesh Zika, that Zika Kikenus Yadami. Doesn't make a difference, Yibam or not Yibam, it's all the same thing. Okay, so now the Gemara is going to challenge. And we're going to challenge and challenge and challenge, and ultimately, the Gemara is going to fail with some of the challenges, but succeed in others. And at the end, we're going to quote a Rav Papa who disagrees with Rabbi Oishia, who limits the leniency of Rabbi Shimon, who will learn it the way when we quoted this din of Rabbi Shimon in the first Pedic, we quoted already the way Rav Papa learned it. That Rabbi Shimon will agree that if Noilad v'achar kach yibem, then Levi can never do Yibam or Chalitza with her. Whereas Rabbi Shimon lenient only if Yibem v'achar kach noilad. Okay, that's the whole daf. But let's go to the challenges against Rabbi Oishia. Ma'ask v'lo Rabbi Yosef. So Rabbi Yosef asks Rabbi Oishia, Hashta, I'm going to show you a Mishnah in where Rabbi Shimon is going to paint a scenario that not only is there Zika, there's always Zika, but Shimon did Maimer. Means there's Zika and Maimer. And still Rabbi Shimon has a doubt how to define the connection between Shimon and Rachel. And you're telling me that Zika itself is like a marriage? That if there's Zika and Maimer, Rabbi Shimon doesn't know how to define that relationship. So Zika l'chudi mibaya. And Mayi, where did we learn the din of Rabbi Shimon? Let's go to the case of Tran. Shloisha Achim Nesuyim. Get used to this. There are three brothers, Reuven, Shimon, and Levi. This will be a case that each one of the brothers married a different sister, a non-related sister. A non-related woman. They're not sisters. Shloisha Achim Nesuyim Shalish Nashim Nachriyos. Not, God forbid, Nachriyos. Nachriyos means they're not related. Let's go, Reuven dies. Now don't forget something. If Reuven dies and Shimon dies, Levi is obligated to do either Yibum or Chalitza to both of these wives. When do we say there's only a mitzvah to do it to one of the wives? If 2 wives or 3 wives are coming from one brother. They're coming from one bias. You have to build your brother's bias, not batim. But if a man has various brothers, then he has to do Yibum or Chalitza to each brother's widows. So here what happened was...
There's no limit to how many you can be married to.
Mamish. Umeis, well, there is a limit. There's 18 wives. Right. Umeis echad mehen, 18 wives for a king. Yeah. I think for a commoner it's less. Umeis echad mehen, and let's go, Reuven dies. And v'asav l'cha halt kop. Now, don't forget, according to Rabbi Shimon, according to Rabbi Ishia, Rachel is already like Shimon's wife. Don't forget, the more Rachel is like Shimon's wife, it changes everything. But here the case was that Shimon did maimer to Rachel. And now Shimon died. So says the Mishnah, Hadei Elu, both Shimon's only wife and Reuven's widow, who became engaged to Shimon, why? Because it says in the pasuk, Umeis echad mehem yavoy aleha. So we learn from this pasuk, Mishe aleha zikas yavam echad. When is there a mitzvah to do yibum or chalitza on a widow who is a widow from one brother? But over here, Rachel, whose widow is Rachel's? Well, not so simple. Nishklar. She's definitely Reuven's widow, but she might be Shimon's widow. Why is she Shimon's widow? Because if Maimer is a marriage, even though it's only a rabbinic marriage, then you got Shimon's widow. Now 1 second, this only explains why you can't do Yibum to Rachel. What about to the wife of Shimon? So it's very simple. Being that Maimer might be like marriage, if the Maimer is like marriage, and this woman is the widow of 2 brothers, Levi cannot marry her. The moment you cannot do Yibum with one, you automatically cannot do Yibum to the co-wife. That was the first Mishnah in the whole Masechta. But Chalitza do. Rab Shimon says, Miyabim le'ezim mehem she'yirtzam, v'choylitz l'shniya. He says, do Yibum with one of them, any one of them, and you have to do Chalitza with the other. Why? What's Rab Shimon's logic? So let's do this by heart. Rab Shimon, so far we had a Beis Shammai who holds that Maimer is marriage. Let's take Beis Shammai out. We have the other Tanoim that hold that Maimer is a rabbinic marriage. It's a rabbinic, it's like a shvacha marriage. Rab Shimon doesn't hold that Maimer is a weak marriage. Rab Shimon himself has a doubt. Either Maimer is the way Beis Shammai learns it, Maimer is a full-fledged marriage, or Maimer is nothing. Now let's work out both sides. And because of this doubt, he says this then. Shimon did Maimer. Let's go boy. If Maimer is real marriage, then she's not the widow of 2 husbands. She's only the widow of Shimon. That was the whole case of our Mishnah regarding Levi. So you can do Yibum or Chalitza with her, but if it was a full-fledged marriage, Shimon had 2 wives. If Shimon had 2 wives, Levi is not allowed to marry both. You can only marry one. And once you married one, what is the other one? The erva of Eshes Ach. Now, the moment there's no mitzvah of Yibum Chalitza, then the other wife is your brother's wife. You can't marry your brother's wife. If Maimer is nothing, so we have 2 women. One is Reuven's widow, one is Shimon's widow. You need to do Yibum or Chalitza with both. So therefore, says Rab Shimon, doing Yibum with one is zikr not a problem. You can't do Yibum with the other, because maybe Maimer, is a full-fledged marriage, and if that would be the case, then you can't do Yibum with 2 wives of the same husband. You have to Chalitza because maybe it's not. So the kasha of Rabbi Yosef is Gavalik. First, if Rab Shimon clearly holds that even when there's Maimer, he has a doubt whether Maimer is like a marriage or not. What would be the logic of Rabbi Yoshia that the moment Reuven died, Shimon and the widow are already considered married. Kikanus Yadamia, which is why if Levi is born even before Yibum, if Shimon marries her and then Shimon dies, there's a mitzvah Yibum on Levi. No, even where there's Maimer, Rab Shimon had a doubt. There's Zika and Maimer, and there's a doubt, and you're telling me without Maimer it's for sure marriage? Doesn't fit. That Yibum Itarvayuloi, because the Dilma Yesh Zika, and Vahavu Shnei Yevamos Abois, Mibayis Echad, in which you can only do Yibum with one. To do Yibum with one and to do nothing with the other, also Loi. Why not? Because Rab Shimon holds Dilma Ein Zika Kekanusa. Maybe even with the Maimer and with the Zika, it's nothing. And if it's nothing, so then she's only Reuven's widow. Levi has to do something with her. Havalu Shnei Yevamos Abois Mishnei Batim. And therefore do Yibum with one, anyone you want, and do Chalitza with the other. Alma, we see that Misapkale, that Rab Shimon has a doubt. Great question against the explanation of Rabbi Oishia, which is only explained by saying that there is Zika Kiknusa Damion. And if you're going to answer, V'chitema says Rabbi Yosef himself, that Midoiraisa Hachinami, Rab Shimon holds Midoiraisa, Zika itself is like marriage. And let's think it out by heart, and if Zika is like marriage, even before Maimer, then Reuven's wife, who died, is now Shimon's wife. And Shimon had two wives. She's not a double widow, she's only Shimon's widow. When Shimon dies, Shimon had two wives, do Yibum or Chalitza only with one, and the other one is exempt. And Hachinami that Midoraisa the Miyavna Chada, Miftara Chada. Only Midrabanan who the Aser, Shemoy. Why? Because since he didn't marry her, he only did Maimer to her. So people might say, Gezeira Mishum, Shemoy Yemru, Beis Yevamos, Abois Mishnei Batim, are completely, you only have to do Yibum with one and not with the other. People know that she's Reuven's widow, and they know that Shimon didn't do marriage. Maybe it's only Midrabanan. So that will be the answer. So the Gemara says, Chada, Miyabna, V'ida, Miftar B'lei Klum. We don't want people to think that. But that's not the reason of Rab Shimon. Because you are explaining this Mishnah by saying that Rab Shimon is afraid that people might end up saying that if Levi had two brothers, Reuven and Shimon, and they both died, that he only has to do Yibum or Chalitza with one of the two, and that's not correct. You got to do it with each one. It's only a fear, so that it has nothing to do with how strong Maimer is. But we know that Rab Shimon explained his opinion, and Rab Shimon articulated that the reason why he says Yibum with whichever one you want, and Chalitza with the other one, Rab Shimon says, because I don't know what Maimer is. Rab Shimon has a doubt what Maimer is. Rab Shimon mishum Maimer v'lav Maimer hu. The Tanya, like we learned, Amalehem Rabbi Shimon l'chachamim im mamari shel sheni Maimer. Rab Shimon is explaining himself. If Maimer is a marriage, if it's a marriage, then Eisha sheni hu boil. And if Levi would marry both of them, you're not allowed to marry both wives of your brother. And im amar shel sheni eino maimer, then who is this? Then who is this woman? She's only Reuven's widow. Then eishis rishon hu bayil. And therefore, Rab Shimon says chalitza. So that's a question against Rabbi Yoshua. And we'll stop over here.